Hey, what's going on, guys? We are continuing our journey back across the U.S. We are in eastern Washington, heading towards Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. We're on Interstate 90, and thought of another topic to talk about today, and it's like related to our topic that we did yesterday about radar detector manufacturers and their unique and individual contributions to the industry over, my 45 plus years of driving with radar detectors, which is a pretty long time. And I figured a related video that I could do would be to speak about the significant radar detector benchmarks or seminal moments with products in this industry over the 45 years or so that I've been driving with radar detectors. Now, it's not going to be a complete list per se, and some of your choices may be different than mine, and I may not even touch on every single one, but I'm going to touch on the ones that made the most impression in my life, and I think set up designs that set up future generations or other versions of radar detectors. So to me, they're just not products, but more like maybe even platforms, things of that nature. So I'm going to start with a radar detector that actually, this one I'm going to start with that predated me in my involvement, which was the FuzzBuster. Now, you may have heard of that term, and I think Victoria just did a lookup on Wikipedia or something like that, indicated the FuzzBuster came out and introduced, I guess, in 1968, so I would not have been quite old enough to drive at that point in time. But I would say, because this was like the first consumer device that was designed to potentially detect the use of radar, that's what I would consider that a significant radar detector. And at the time, I think it was pretty much only X-band, and I don't believe there was even instant on, because instant on use came later, moving radar came later, but X-band. So I would say the FuzzBuster was the first significant product in the consumer space to help drivers be able to deal with the new threat at the time, which was radar. So we fast forward now, and now we're getting into the early part of my entrance into this field, so to speak, or as a consumer, at least initially, were the late 70s, and that was the first Cincinnati microwave. It was called Escort. It was a big box. It was large detector, if you've ever seen them. It was a dual band unit. X and K were the only bands at the time. And what was significant about this product, and perhaps one of the most significant products in all of this industry, is that it was a super heterodyne unit, which was a design that continues to this day, pretty much in every radar detector. So I would say that's a seminal product, perhaps the most significant product, and it was at a time that Mike Valentine happened to be involved, obviously, closely in that organization, significantly so. Now, Whistler, as it turns out, apparently experimented or dabbled with superhet technology prior to the introduction of that Escort, but it never made it to production, so there's a little bit of a trivia there. But that's a significant product. And I would say the next product was the Escort became the Passport, which was the next generation or the next iteration of the Escort product line. And the great thing about that, it was X and K as well, had the same kind of performance, but it was much smaller, and really for many years was probably the smallest radar detector out there. It was thin. And it was an XK unit. It did exceptionally well, and it was great to drive with. So those detectors took us through a good bit of the 80s, and in that time I would have to jump to the next significant very significant radar detector came from Mike Valentine. He sold his interest in Cincinnati Microwave, started venturing out on his own company. I think he had his own design philosophy and where he wanted to take radar detectors, and he was best, I guess, outside of Cincinnati Microwave, and so he started out. And what was significant about Mike's radar detector? This was around 1990, right? So this was a dual horn front and rear radar detector, the first of its kind. He called it, I think, a directional locator, radar locator. And, you know, it was all the rage. All the rage. And I used, at that time, I was in the cars. You know, I was the kind of kid that had, you know, Lamborghini Countach on the wall, along with Farrah Fawcett or, you know, that, or Raquel Welch, but it was cars. And that time I subscribed to, you know, all the car magazines, big ones, Car and Driver, Road and Track, Motor Trend kind of thing. And Valentine advertised heavily in those magazines, and he was generally always on the back cover, so you couldn't miss it. And you know, I'd certainly had my share of tickets. I knew I loved to drive, and I certainly liked to drive fast when able to. And you know, the whole Valentine V1 just redefined the whole game, with the idea of being able to know not only that you were picking up radar, but what direction it was coming from. So very, very important. That was helpful when you were passing radar sources, or you were thinking you were passing a radar source, or you had, and yet there was another threat in front of you that you would not necessarily have known. So by having those directional information, it really allowed drivers who were proficient in radar detectors to be able to better analyze what was going on around them. Another couple significant aspects of Valentine, which are still to this day super important, is their quickness in reacting. We're going to do another video on that at some point, but they were pretty fast to react relative to other manufacturers, which was good for detecting instant on radar up ahead, giving you that idea of texture, that the radar was being on, turned on, turned off, turned on, turned off, and you were able to gauge that you were coming into an instant on trap. Another significant aspect of the Valentine was when laser was introduced. I think that was around 92. First LTI. You know, at the time, Escort came out with a separate laser detector that piggybacked on top of their radar detector. But ultimately, Valentine came up with an integrated laser radar detector system. And the nice thing about the Valentine was it was a tall radar detector. And what that enabled Mike and his engineering team to do was to put a very large, almost like a fisheye parabolic lens in front of the laser sensor, and the laser performance on that detector was just not to be believed. And even to this day, it's a wonderful, wonderful capability that was the high water benchmark for many years. Now, during that time, I had started developing the Veil. There was no laser jammers or any other type of countermeasure for laser at the time. So, and I started, I think, sort of what was the impetus for that, I remember reading, I think it was a Car and Driver article, that they were trying to come up with ways to defeat laser, and they were using a 3 headlight system. So they would put a third headlight in the center, almost like a Tucker, and then just turn on this and try to overwhelm it. And they had some level of effect against it. But then that got me thinking about, well, maybe there's a way to absorb since it's light. And so that started Vail's journey, my journey into embedding and developing this product. And I bring that up because before we shipped our very first Vail, we went to SML, Speed Measurement Labs, in early 2000s, and we weren't going to ship the product until we had a favorable test and a check mark. We didn't, we had to overcome the perceptions of passive and RMR and all those things. And there was a bias against those products, anything that claimed to be a passive. So I bring all that up because it was there at SML in those early 2000s that I began to meet the other manufacturers and really get more exposed to the products. And it was around that time when I met Roy from RadarBusters. He was, early on in starting this company, met some of the other key players in these manufacturers, and in that process got introduced to some of the other products that were out there. And I'm going to bring up these more seminal products. And I would say the RX-65 Beltronics, that was in that time frame, the 8500 from Escort, which later became the 8500 X50. And I see both of those products, which were being tested around that time, I consider to be significant. I started driving with them. I had pretty much been a Valentine user just for years, but started really enjoying and having the pleasure of driving with the 8500, which the X50 eventually, and the RX-65. And it's important to make a distinction here between the Escorts of the past and today. I think at the time, the Escort 7500 was really the last product, again in that period, that Escort actually made. And when Beltronics and Escort came together, I always felt that the engineering strength really came from the Beltronics side. And I viewed Escort more as a marketing company, and Beltronics was more of the engineering powerhouse, if you will. In fact, I remember one time visiting Escort in their Westchester office, which is outside of Cincinnati, and it was both Beltronics and Escort in the company. And it was fascinating because they were really two different companies under the same roof. They probably had two different balance sheets. They certainly had two different cultures. And it's funny, I would walk down the halls and there would be cubicles, and it was like on one side you'd have somebody with a Beltronics, kind of thing, and then you'd come to another one and it was an Escort, and there was tension there. Definitely there was tension there between the two. But, at some point, products where the engineering was being merged, in effect, and so the Escort 8500 X50 was really similar to an RX-65. I think it was an S7 platform, very, very well-regarded platform for many years, and rightly so. So I put those two products together because they're so closely related. So let's fast forward now to the latter part of 2000. And that is obviously when Beltronics came out with the STi Driver. The STi Driver was an absolute fabulous radar detector, and it also upset the game in a big way. And it upset the game on a number of levels. One, it was unique, what they called the M3 platform, that had two radar antenna horns facing one direction. So unlike the Valentine that had a front and rear facing horn for the directional, the M3 STi Driver had two. One horn was tailored to X-band, specifically tweaked, and then the other horn was for K and KA. And the detector was just fabulous. It was made out of magnesium. The only other one that really was the Valentine. So this was a really solid detector. It had an LNA, low noise amplifier, in the circuitry, which really was able to add a significant amount of sensitivity, and it also played a role in, which was the first detector really of its kind, which was being undetectable by spectra. And I think it was widely regarded that such a design couldn't even have been done. And I remember years ago being at one of the SML tests. There was this great guy I met from Australia. We're still friends to this day. You know who you are if you're watching. Love you. He worked there was some real connection with Stalker or Stealth Microsystems outside of Brisbane. And I don't exactly know what there was, but there were some personal issues going on there, and he made it his mission. And his initials are RZ. So for those who know RZ, and he worked on developing what he believed to be, or was, an undetectable Valentine. And he was very guarded with it. He never lent it out to anybody. And he showed it, and they tested it. And I remember he had told me, he once had a conversation with Mike Valentine. Mike didn't believe it was even possible. And Mike, I consider like the Pope of the industry. But, and so for years, the only way to get an undetectable detector in Australia for Spectra was with his modifications. So, at any rate, fast forward now, number of years, and now Beltronics comes up with what they claim to be an undetectable radar detector. And sure enough, they actually did accomplish it. And so, to me, that's a significant radar detector because it completely redefined what was thought to be possible in a radar detector, in that it's undetectable. Okay. Now, I remember I was told who the engineer who designed that, and his initials were MB. I'll leave that at that. He retired recently. I finally got a chance to meet him. Brilliant guy. Anybody who can come up with a design like that. On a side note, just to throw some side thinking, he was a big fan of ribs. He had recommended a place to go, and we weren't impressed, right? We went there. It really wasn't impressive. So I give him credit for knowing how to build a fabulous radar platform, but so far as his culinary opinion when it comes to barbecue, not so much. But anyway, the STi Driver, which later became the Magnum, and ultimately led into Escort's own version of that, which was the Redline. But even so, even as well regarded as the Redline was, to me, it's not as seminal in that it was the M3 STi Driver that really redefined. So that's another significant radar detector in the history of this industry, in my opinion. And then that takes me, basically almost another decade forward, because for the most part, radar detectors didn't really change much. The 8500 X50 had a really long run. The RX-65 had a long run. The Valentine, obviously, number of decades of run in it. So what changed? What changed? Well, I'll throw another detector out there, although it really didn't do much for me, quite frankly. But it was significant, and that was the 9500i. Okay, the 9500, which later became the 9500iX. And what made that detector significant was the incorporation of GPS. Okay, so what did GPS allow? It allowed the speed to be considered into, let's say, the performance of a radar detector. So you could vary the sensitivity, which has been a long, troubling problem. You put it on highway mode or city mode, depending on where you were. Well, with GPS now, you can put it on this auto mode kind of deal, and auto sensitivity, and based on your speed, it would basically change what I would consider not so much the sensitivity of the radar, but the apparent sensitivity of the radar detector, effectively, which allowed you to essentially have the best of both worlds. So it would be less sensitive when you're driving slowly around town, and yet opened up when you've opened the tabs up on the highway. So, and then it also had ultimately a GPS database for marking locations, ultimately auto learning for those who wanted to filter out stationary, and then ultimately GPS led to photo enforcement databases. And so that technology has basically now made it into all significant radar detectors today, on the top tier radar detectors. And I don't really consider a radar detector without some form of GPS, whether it's built in or adjunct with an app like. But I will tell you the 9500 and 9500 IX I was not a fan of on an individual basis because it just had operating characteristics that I just didn't like and felt, frankly, were a big step backward for Escort, coming from what I considered a quintessential detector, the 8500 X50. And that's been an issue that's been carried with them for many, many years, despite feedback to the contrary. But so, not a fan of the individual detector, the 9500i or the 9500iX. But insofar as it being a significant product and changing the game, I would say that's a significant product in that regard. And then it's going to take me to the last detector in my series, which came about, in about 2016/17, when Uniden got back into the game. They had been in and out of the radar detector industry with half measures over the years, but with the R1 and then R3 radar detectors, and it just completely redefined what was possible in a radar detector in performance and distance sensitivity, in quickness for alerting to I/O combined with that, and at a price point that was very affordable. And it really became the best I would say the best radar detectors insofar as quantity of volume. Certainly in RadarBusters history, I should think, probably the 8500s probably, it may be similar, but they had a longer run of selling the 8500, right? So insofar as what was possible in a radar detector, the R3 completely reset what was possible. And what was significant about that, not only from the experience of a driver and having these high-popping detections, it was significant that it changed how the manufacturers had to really get serious and get off their laurels and catch up. And they're still doing that, in my opinion. So, Valentine grudgingly, I'll use that word, updated to a V1G2. Escort, certainly now Whistler with their Titan. These companies have had to completely readjust what they were doing in their top engineering just to be competitive with Uniden. So that's pretty much it. Are there any other significant products? I could talk about a remote custom installed, but that could be its own thing. So I'm just going to keep it to dash mount detectors. So what did I cover? About 6 or so radar detectors over about 45 years or so of my driving, 48 years, whatever. They're the ones that stick out in my mind. You may have your own. You may have your own personal experiences, which make those your own. And I'd love to hear them if you want to throw some out. But from my perspective, these are the top significant radar detectors, and we'll see what tomorrow brings in technology and products. But for now, that's pretty much it. Hope you liked it. Hope you found it informative. Again, visit RadarBusters.com. They're taking pre-orders for the R9 still. That's going to be released in, I think, about 2 weeks. We're going to have some formal tests we're going to publish after we get back from our trip, which is about three days or so. So be sure, if you're interested in getting one of those, get your order in. They're going to be shipping in a couple weeks. If you like the video, give us a thumbs up, please. We always appreciate that. Hit the bell, get notified when we publish new, and certainly we appreciate you sharing our videos on social media. And as it relates to social media, visit us on Facebook, RadarBusters Online there. You'll find us with the little rabbit logo. Please join. We're very late on social media, so we have a lot of catching up to do. But, we can start small and hopefully grow and go for quality instead of quantity. So we hope you participate on those. And we'll see you in one of our next videos. Take care. Be safe.